This map of the late 19th-century Highlands and Hebridean Islands shows a region often described as a vast, romantic wilderness. As the Gaelic aristocracy was absorbed into the British capitalist order, traditional clan chiefs transformed into commercial landlords. They retreated into grand estate houses, increasingly separated from their people by both wealth and economic interest. Under this new management, land use was determined entirely by market returns. Proprietors calculated that massive commercial sheep runs and exclusive sporting estates generated far more profit than the thousands of families living on the land. The engineered silence of the modern Highlands was the result of viewing the indigenous population as a barrier to productive efficiency. In this landscape, humans were treated as an obstacle to be cleared. The communal heart of this society was the township. Families survived through a delicate balance, farming tiny individual plots while relying on shared access to the surrounding hills for grazing. Even more vulnerable were the cotters. This landless class lived on the absolute margins, possessing no legal right to the soil and depending entirely on casual labor and the scraps of the township to survive. The system collapsed when landlords began confiscating the common grazings. As the hills were fenced off for commercial sheep, the townships lost the pasture essential to their cattle-based economy. Families were forced onto tiny, exhausted patches of land. They became dangerously dependent on a single crop, the potato, and seasonal labor in the south just to pay their rising rents. Legally, these people were tenants at will. They had no security of tenure, leaving them vulnerable to rack renting and arbitrary removal by the estate manager, or factor. Families lived under the shadow of sudden eviction. Factors used the threat of removal to maintain absolute control, ensuring that any tenant who complained faced homelessness in the middle of a Highland winter. By weaponizing insecurity, the landlord class suppressed local initiative and kept the population in a state of constant, precarious dependence. Resistance began to surface in 1874 at Bernera, on the island of Lewis. When estate authorities tried to push through new grazing restrictions, the Crofters successfully blocked the sheriff officers, marking the first major break in the factor's authority. By 1882, the island of Skye was in open revolt. The township of Braes launched a rent strike, demanding the return of grazing rights on Ben Lee, a hill the estate had leased to a sheep farmer years before. The authorities responded by sending 50 Glasgow policemen to assist with evictions. They were met by a crowd of hundreds who repelled the officers with stones and sticks in a confrontation that became known as the Battle of the Braes. This wasn't a military campaign, it was a tactical escalation where communities used rent strikes, organized land raids, and physical obstruction of the law to make the estate system ungovernable. Braes demonstrated that a unified community could successfully defy the landlord's enforcers and shatter the illusion that estate power was absolute. This local defiance was amplified by a radical Highland press. John Murdoch's newspaper, The Highlander, turned isolated township disputes into a regional cause, linking the Glens through a shared political message. In the South, urban Highland societies and second-generation emigrants provided the movement with funding and political connections that the Crofters could never have accessed alone. Traditional Gaelic culture provided the emotional infrastructure. Songs and poems acted as a social media of the day, identifying cruel factors by name and preserving the memory of the struggle in the communal mind. The British government responded with a mix of force and concession. They dispatched military gunboats to suppress the unrest, while simultaneously appointing a royal commission to investigate the people's grievances. By merging physical defiance in the islands with political machinery in the cities, the Crofters forced the state to intervene directly in the private business of the great estates. In 1883, a Napier Commission began taking evidence directly from the people. They traveled through the islands, creating an official record of the conditions inside the townships. For the first time, Crofters stood before a royal body and articulated decades of abuse. They spoke of rack rents and evictions with the knowledge that the world was finally listening. The Commission's final report was a disappointment to many. It ignored landless cotters and refused to recommend returning the massive sheep farms to the people. But the political landscape changed with the 1884 Franchise Act. In Ross-shire, eligible voters rocketed from 2,000 to over 10,000. The newly enfranchised bypassed landlords entirely, sending their own representatives to the House of Commons. By capturing these seats, the Crofters had moved the fight out of the glens and into the heart of the British legislature. This political pressure resulted in the 1886 Crofters Holdings Act, the first piece of legislation to recognize the land rights of the Highland people. The act was a pragmatic compromise that prioritized political stability over radical redistribution. It did not solve the congestion in the townships or return the large sheep runs, but it addressed the fundamental source of landlord power. It granted people security of tenure, established courts to set fair rents, ending the era of arbitrary clearance. Because of these laws, the community remained anchored to the soil. The people treated as removable assets became a permanent presence on their ancestral land. The Crofters War was the moment a marginalized population refused to be erased. They took their history of suffering and transformed it into testimony, politics, and finally, law.